Welcome back to another episode of Adventures in Machine Learning. I'm one of your hosts, Michael Burke, and I do data engineering and machine learning at Databricks. Today, I am joined by my co host.
Ben Wilson. I talk about ML Flow at summits.
And today, we are joined by Keith. He started his career as a systems engineer at EDS, and since then, he's taken on a variety of roles ranging from product management, solution architecting, business development, pretty much you name it. Currently, he is VP of Services at Zeroed In, a data focus, a HR focused data solution. So, Keith, we were chatting before the episodes as we usually do, and I'm curious your take on a semi controversial topic. What role should data play in the hiring process? Should we completely automate it? Should it be augmenting human decisions or something else?
Great question. I think in the future we're going to see it obviously increase in the amount of value that data can add to the hiring process. Will it ever become fully automated? I doubt it. I think there's still going to be a level of human interaction to ensure the person's real, that there's someone behind there, things that maybe the data couldn't catch. But it is growing immensely. And it's not just the current data, the data from the resume, but it's also utilizing historical data to help make that decision even better. So I think we're going to see it grow. We're just starting to see the amount of data that's going into the resume. I think it's going to grow even more. And as I mentioned, looking at more historical data and coming up with more better models, machine learning models that can help that decision making process. But I don't see it turning over to a fully 100% automated. Perhaps in some roles that are well defined and the criteria is extremely well defined. But for the masses, I still believe there's going to be a human oversight to it.
Cool. So I have done a variety of hirings. Ben has done a variety of hirings. Keith, I know you've done a variety of hirings as well. And I've been surprised at what candidates outperform expectations. Typically, if you're hiring a rock star, I like in my experience, I've been able to see pretty early, and I've been right. Obviously, there's a lot of selection bias within this, but there's been some people that have really surprised me when I thought, all right, they're going to be okay, but then they come in with a great work ethic, a great attitude, and they go and learn really fast and become an expert quite quickly. So I understand that resume screening, and when you look it on paper, that's quite easy to screen out. But Ben and Keith, I'm curious your take. How do you think about finding those diamonds in the rough?
Ben, do you want to start or?
I mean, I can talk about my process, and it does start with reading a resume. Uh, I'm more of a red flag person, which when I think about applying machine learning, uh, even simple algorithms, I think that part of what I have done in the past could be 100% automated. So, although it's probably not the simplest model to build, um, I look for hyperbolic statements, things where somebody's claiming something that I know just by reading a few sentences that they're probably taking credit for a whole bunch of other people's work, or what they're explaining in the amount of time that they gave to that project is infeasible. There's no way that they could have done what they claim to have done in the scope of what they're stating. And that doesn't disqualify it. That just means this is what we're talking about on the face-to-face interview, because I want to hear this story. Um, but I also look for really simple things in resume writing where it's the same thing that I would expect from somebody that's my peer or subordinate to me, which is when we when there's a success, it's a we. When there's a failure, it's a me. And if you can explain things in those terms and have that tone, and also it's really great when I see in a resume that somebody claims that they messed something up and then learn from it and fixed it. That's sort of another flag. It's a green flag for me. But going through that process of identifying that, I'm looking at tone and like, how is this person going to work in a team, and are they being honest?
Yeah, those are great points. And to go on to that, I think I'm a believer and have seen a lot of out of aptitude testing to help weed clients as well. So depending on the role that coming in for, but yeah, aptitude testing can be a good sign. And going on to that with that resume aspect, I think we are seeing where some of the models out there, machine learning models, can really start delving into some of those criteria that one might see and that you, Ben, are picking up on the resume. I think that's a great opportunity for some model generation. But to answer, Michael, some of your question, I believe it's also fostering the environment where certain people can be successful. So, it's kind of like, is it genetics or is it nurturing? I do believe the aspect of nurturing candidates. I've seen good candidates come into a difficult place and leave quickly. And one might say, well, that was a bad hire decision. I don't think so. So there's two ends of that I think one could argue.
Interesting.
Yeah, I've definitely lived that. Uh, it's I think there's nothing more jarring than having a really great interview at a company with one or two people, and you're like, man, I got a really good feeling about this place. And then right after you're done, you're onboarding and you get put into a cubicle and you start working, and you just see like a very toxic, hostile environment, people being belittled next to you, or managers that are completely checked out. Nobody really cares. You're like, what am I doing here? And then you start, updating the resume and sending it out. So like, I can't waste my time here. Um, yeah, it's tragic when it happens when you have like a really good person who gets into a role and then they just leave. Yeah.
Yeah, and you think about that. I mean, some would argue, well, that's just either the candidate's fault or poor decision making. But the underlying result is it was neither.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Another potentially saucy question. Uh, so the data knows who the person is on paper, as we were alluding to before. How do you handle diversity and inclusion initiatives when someone may not look the best on paper, but you want to hire them via an affirmative action type of model?
I'll start with a thought. I believe at the organizations I've seen, most of the time that gets down to more of a human decision making process where the machine language or the data may point a certain direction, but there's always that human interaction that can override and make those decisions. So we see that happening. Um, that's how I would answer that question.
Humans. All right, cool. Yeah, it's just an interesting concept to think about. Having data try to enter into human like soft judgment types of decision making processes. Um, Ben, how do you guys handle diversity and inclusion?
So we're very much a it doesn't matter uh, sort of organization. So there's no like the requirements to come and do the job that we do means that there's no human bias that's placed on any sort of like national origin, original language that you speak growing up, or your gender, or anything. Nobody cares. And I mean that in a positive way, is that everybody gets the exact same fair shot. And it's not so much heavily loaded on things that would be biased in society coming into an interview, which is it's everybody knows in the tech industry, you look at the distribution in computer science or math or physics programs, it's predominantly white males in America that are in those programs that get fed into software engineering jobs historically. And that's changing over time. So we now have the most internationally and gender diverse software engineering group that I've ever seen. Uh, lot of people from all around the world, from all sorts of different backgrounds, because they're just good and they exhibit the cultural like values that we have, which is you don't interact differently with anybody anywhere in the teams. Everybody, it's not like we're one big happy family. We're all one big happy, respect all of your peers sort of organization, and everybody's voice matters. Um, and that's distilled from on top by the founders. And it's that inclusion is just part of the cultural value. But I've been places where I saw the opposite end of that, where the only thing that people care about is what school did you go to, which that's bias as well. Like, do you come from an upbringing that silver spoon that's in your mouth helped you get to that place, and people that were struggling in other places couldn't get to that college, or couldn't work at that Fortune 100 company. It's not on your resume, so people just don't even consider that candidate. And it's toxic, and you just perpetuate this cycle of furthering exclusionary tactics that it doesn't even look at somebody. They won't even get a face-to-face interview because they're like, oh, you didn't go to Dartmouth, it's or Princeton. It's ridiculous, and the company suffers for it.
Got it. Real quick note, let's take a pause. Keith, do you mind, there's a lot of background on your end. Do you mind going to the settings tab in the bottom and ensuring that your audio is coming from your headset and not your laptop? So we can hear a lot of tapping on the desk and such.
Okay. Is there a way to turn down the sensitivity as well?
There should be, yes. But maybe not. There's a box to reduce mic background noise.
Okay, there it is. Yeah. Okay, I set both of those.
And it's to your headset, correct?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Great. Hopefully that'll help a little bit.
Yeah. I don't see a save option, so I guess just close it. Yeah, and I'll try to keep a mute option as well.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just, so again, we got a few people tuning in for the stream, but we'll just edit this out, so it'll be seamless. Cool. Ben, before we kick it off, you were saying, right, okay, diversity and inclusion background. Cool.
Yeah, Ben was, there's a thought that came to mind when listening to that, and some of our clients' experience that's fairly new. In New York, they passed the legislation in the state that any predictive modeling that they do regarding their workforce and people has to have bias audits performed against them from a DEI perspective. I thought that was pretty interesting. Where things are going. Your organization, Ben, seems like it's a very inclusive environment in general, just because that's the way it is. But you also have that legislative perspective that's trying to also force that type of environment out there as well. So two ways of getting there, I guess.
Yeah. So at Zeroed In, what exactly are you guys doing different than all the other data-driven HR solutions?
So as we talked about before, HR is from a HR systems perspective is very siloed. Organizations in the HR typically do best of breed, whether it's their payroll system or learning management system, performance management system. There are great systems out there that perform those tasks very well. And yes, there are some organizations like Workday that have a lot of those processes already built into one application, but still there are many organizations that haven't taken that leap and still have their processes inside of different applications. So where I would say we do a great job is we work with our clients and we don't force them to put their data in our format in order for them to say, in order for us to say, here are your 1,000 metrics that you want to monitor. Some of our competitors do it that way, where they're like, okay, give us all your data in this format, and we'll give you these 500 metrics. Our approach is really more working with the client, understanding we have templates in those different areas that we start with, but if an organization already has data feeds that they're moving throughout their organization to other vendors, we like to utilize what they already have in place. Try not to reinvent that wheel, and we want to make it easy for them. We want to make it easier for them to start getting metrics and getting value out of their data. And of course, every organization feels that they're unique in the way that they manage their data. So we like to try to keep that uniqueness and that feel for them. And so our application is highly configurable when it comes to that. We are able to work with multiple ETL routines to get the data into what we call a staging environment, and then we have templates that we'll start building our metrics from. But we work with our clients to understand, okay, well, how does your organization count their employees? Is it at the beginning of the month, end of the period, or often we utilize what's called a daily average headcount that gives more fidelity in terms of how people are moving throughout the organization. So just unique things like that. And there's working with the client, there's hundreds of things that then you start opening up peeling back the layers of the onion and find out that this company does something a very unique way, and they want to preserve that. So I would think that's one way we differentiate ourselves in the market. We also will build out predictive models. For example, take flight risk. Most systems, or a lot of systems that handle people, will have a flight risk model. Maybe they're using client data and a benchmark of all historical data or all data from other clients. And that's great. It might produce a fairly accurate prediction that they can then assign to individuals. But what we're finding is our clients, they want to know a couple things. They want to know what's going into the model. So a lot of times those systems are black box. They're just producing a metric where we'll work with our clients. We'll identify the items that go into the building the model. We'll discuss the model with them. We'll change out features on what's going to drive a higher rate of accuracy. And so, we kind of come up with a very unique prediction and a model for each client. Then the other aspect, I think, is that we've generated what we call explainable AI. So after we generate a prediction, anytime we generate a prediction, we also have a method to roll back through the prediction on any prediction case. For example, flight risk. If they identified Sally as a high flight risk, the client often says, well, why? And so we can take that prediction, run it backwards through the model, and identify what features the AI model utilized mostly to come up with that prediction. And then that gives the client a little bit better method to determine what they should do. Should they increase pay? Is it perhaps a problem with their supervisor? Whatever the case might be. But it gives more insight in terms of that prediction. When it's a black box prediction, you don't always get that.
Nice. And can you speak to any of the methods, just out of curiosity, like how they work on the back end?
Are you referring to any model tools that we're using, or data
Yes.
aspects?
So you talked about a lot of very important aspects of machine learning. So just straight up prediction models, model explainability, a variety of other things. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to any of the stack you're using, any of the packages or libraries, any of the models specifically.
Sure. We like to utilize XGBoost. It's a nice algorithm for prediction. It also has a nice, we can utilize several explainers for that. That's where we've mostly spent our time with it. Are you familiar with that model?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So, yeah, that's one of the primary ones we would utilize for prediction.
Nice. And it would make sense that decision trees would lend well to explainability. So when you build out a decision tree, it will actually, you can visualize the splits. And sometimes like salary at $30,000.26 thousand or whatever, like the splits are a bit specific, but oftentimes if you extrapolate out what the splits are actually saying, there's some really interesting insights. I remember countless projects where I would build out trees, visualize them, and then I mean, again, they can be over optimized to for prediction and less so for explainability. But if you build a stable model, there's often insights in those splits.
Yeah, and that's why we really try to work with our clients to identify and you know recreate or generate the model and kind of keep tweaking it until we come up with the right features that go into it. The other thing as well as the explainable AI that comes out, we can also utilize a what if analysis tool. So think of a really nice waterfall chart for each prediction, uh, and then shows what each feature did for the prediction, and then you can maybe tweak that and say, okay, well, if we promoted Sally, how would that keep her to stay? Or and of course, sometimes based off the features you use, you can't change those things, but it's nice to see what would happen anyway.
Yeah, Ben, I'm
Yeah,
curious.
those
Or go ahead.
simulation modeling tools become very interesting when applied to human resources data, in my experience. I've worked on a couple of projects internal to companies where people ask stuff like that, like, "Hey, we're not going to give you any of the employee names or anything about what department they work in, but here's the data." And it some you know working on some of these projects, it was kind of shocking what they were collecting on like how employees were doing things. It's like, man, how did you get like the open rate of their emails in this format? And they're like, well, that comes as this tool that we use. I'm like, oh, that's cool. That's useful. What about the sentiment analysis that you get from their internal communications and how that changes over time? And they're like, well, we don't know how that works, but we work with a vendor that does that, but we don't know. We can't read what the conversations are. It's like, that's good that nobody can see that. But you start looking at all that data and then you throw it into a tool like what if, and you start saying like, well, how do I, like, if I bump this thing up, is this indicative of this other behavioral thing? Like, why did this employee all of a sudden change in this quarter? And then you go back and look through the data and you're like, oh, they didn't get a promotion, even though this is 1 year after they're up for it. And you start telling like the HR team, like, what's going on here? Like, here's the data you need for this employee to talk to them and see how they're feeling. It's pretty interesting when you start doing stuff like that. You're like, well, if they were promoted, what does the model now predict their flight risk is? And it's like, oh, it drops way down. Like, maybe that's a driver for them.
Yeah, Ben, I'm curious how you think about something that we alluded to earlier, which is sort of the selection bias of only having data typically about the people that you hire. How do you think about incorporating training information about people that you potentially passed on that could have been really good or really bad?
For a hiring decision, I think you need some sort of, you know, you can't just look at who did you hire and what were the behaviors of that. You also have to feed in all of the reject data. And if you really want to do a scientific analysis of something like that, you could only really do that, I think, at a very large company that has Scrooge McDuck money to, hey, we can handle hiring 10% of, we don't know if these people are going to be successful, but they're sort of borderline marginal. And out of that 10% of additional hire that maybe they weren't, 5 stars across the board on all the interview panels, they had a couple 3 stars, maybe a 2 star from one person. You'd probably find that there's a number of people that do exceptionally well at that company. Maybe they're just bad at interviewing, who knows? Or maybe they like the wrong sports team and they got into some discussion, after the interview and just annoyed the interviewer, or the interviewer was having a bad day. Who knows? I think there's so many infinite realm of possibilities of things that can go into, evaluation ratings from a face-to-face talk. But I know there are companies out there that do that. I've worked at them before, and I think it surprises everybody when they do. Well, at those companies that I worked at that were doing that process intentionally, they would have reviews. So that, the typical, oh, we're going to have 30, 60, 90 of check-ins of a new hire, and we're going to evaluate how everything's going. I don't think that works that well, actually. I think it works better if it's 30, 60, 90, 365. Uh, and then you're doing like a 3-year review as well afterwards. And you're saying, and then correlating that back to the initial interview data and saying, are we broken as an organization? Are we even making the right decisions? Do we need to revise, our interview process? And sometimes like smart companies will continuously do that. Like Keith, as you said, that test, that the aptitude test that you can do, if you're not looking at that data 1 year out, correlated to employee performance and happiness or competency, and looking back and saying, okay, for everybody that we've hired that did it, like got a perfect score in the aptitude test, are they technically super confident at their job a year on out? And if not, then our screening's broken. And then the behavioral stuff, like interviewers who are qualified to interview for positions should be going through some sort of continuous training. But part of that continuous training is, how did you rate that person and how are they doing at the company now? And same thing for early stage mentors. Like, did you do a good job getting this person prepared for success at this job? I think data can answer all of that. I'm curious, Keith, like, is that data that some companies work with your company on?
It is, and that's exactly what we do. But I think you'd be totally surprised by how many companies don't. And the reason why they don't is because their talent acquisition data was in one system, the performance in an HRIS system was in another. And we're talking about from an HR perspective, who typically doesn't get IT resources, who comes from more that touchy feely world, and IT resources are off doing finance and production problems and things like that. So most of the time, it doesn't happen just because they don't know how to correlate the numbers from two different systems. Something that easy. Um, and you think about it, from a data perspective, a candidate information is not employee, so they have a totally different ID system, and because they're in a different system, when they do become hired, often they're just generated a new ID, and that link is broken. So what we work with our clients in bringing data together is making that connection back, so that we can report on it, right? And it's really valuable. I mean, it's highly valuable. So you can look at that information during that candidate process, and then look at it 2-3 years later, and how well that person's doing. That can also be used for modeling in the future. So it's really important. And if you don't mind me just touching on something else that you mentioned, and that was the qualitative assessments and evaluations. We primarily work with our clients quantitative data, data from different systems, but we do also have a surveying and assessment component and kind of built into our application. And things, for example, engagement surveys, new hire surveys, exit surveys, and all those can be, because we're working with the client's data already, we can easily set up those recurring evaluations based off of logical aspects, whether it's 30, 60, 90, 365. We can easily set that up and have that go out and collect those evaluations. And many of our clients utilize us to doing that. We're actually trying to take that a step further. I don't know how much evaluation data you guys work with, but we're thinking about a way of using AI so that instead of saying, I want to generate a survey that evaluates people's engagement or people's sentiment around something, where instead of being a psychometrician where you have to come up with your own survey questions and your answers and so forth, we're thinking that if you go to an LLM and say, okay, I want to find out what people think about X. And at that point, it generates the surveys. It works with our applications to identify the people that it's going to be sending it out to. And then when it sends a survey out, no one's ever coded a question. And it may look, it's not just a one-time here the questions. It's like, okay, when a person starts answering it, the the um, the model, the AI model would be able to say, okay, well, I'm going to start asking this type of question. So it's a total like virtual assessment that based off of how a person's answering, the AI is going to know how to phrase the next question in order to get the results back on what the original person was trying to find. What do they think about X? So, I'd love to get your ideas. Have you ever seen anything like that? Do you think it's possible? I'd love to open that up for further discussion.
I'll jump in super quick. This is a really awesome use case that I hadn't even thought of until you brought it up. Maybe we could, I mean, we're still a bit away, but from like this tech being robust, but maybe we can switch out. I don't even want to say the initial phone screen, but at least like technical data collection, where you can just chat with a model and have the model keep poking and prodding until it gets a satisfactory answer. Um, I'm wary of offloading that to a computer with the current state of tech, but phone screens I know are really just challenging, especially if like your technical recruiter is very lenient on who gets through, then the hiring manager is bogged down with half hour or 15-minute conversations. And so augmenting this to some degree, at least for the data collection, definitely not the decision making, but for data collection, uh, is a really interesting use case. What's your take, Ben?
I don't know about the. I mean, you could fine tune an LLM, and it would be a really complex process to do this. But what you described, I think, is technically feasible. Um, you would have to generate a whole bunch of training data for exactly this, and wide, broad, diverse set of questions, and how to do, you know, effectively the conversational lineage. But I think it's possible to do that. Um, but when you started talking about that, first thing that popped in my head is multimodal models where you could have like a transcription and a recording uh, of the actual interview. So phone screen is a sort of an antiquated term these days. Usually it's over, Zoom or Hangouts or something. You have that video feed and that audio feed of that interaction with the interviewer. There's nothing really stopping you from slapping on a post interview analysis of that with something like, hey, you want speech to text transcription? Everybody's using Whisper for that these days. You can slap on a different head to that model and have it analyze, provided that you've fine tuned it to just evaluate sentiment and what are the levels of confidence that this person has in their interaction. And you could say, are they eloquent? Are they well spoken? Do they speak in a manner where they're assertive about what they're claiming that they know? And those could be criteria that you could now have a effective qualitative adjudication of that candidate. Like, hey, for some roles at your company, that might not be important that somebody is assertive. You might not want that, or you don't need that sort of, I know what I'm talking about, and this is how confident I am in my presentation. You want that in a salesperson, definitely. It's something that you need. You need that in an executive. You need somebody who's commanding, who has the ability to communicate their thoughts in a way that is compelling and people listen to. But do you need that in an independent contributor who's working on modeling? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you don't need that. Maybe you don't want that. So effectively mapping somebody's personality traits by the way that they present themselves in front of others could be a good way to say, is this person a good fit for this particular role that we're thinking for them? Because the human level of bias in that, particularly in an initial face-to-face meeting a stranger, evaluating whether they're good for your role, I think humans are inherently flawed and biased in those adjudications. whereas an impartial observer could augment that interviewer's perception of things and say, here's the data of this model that's been trained on millions of interactions. This is what the model detected. Does this align with what the human detected? And that can be something that on an interview panel review board, you say, hey, the model really liked this person, or this is detecting that it's a good fit for this personality mapping to this role. The person that did the interview, they're pretty far off. And you can see, like, does everybody else's model, like interactions that they have with this person, do they all agree? Could be interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. It made me think of this advice my mom retooled for me when I first started doing interviews. She had like read a book or a New York Times article, and this super fancy executive would go, and depending upon the different candidates' role, he would ask them, "How fast did you drive here to the interview?" And this is back when you had to drive to interviews, and if it was a salesperson, they had to be at least 20 over the speed limit. If it was a marketing person, they had to be right on the speed limit. And then if it was like a legal something, just someone in the legal space, they had to be 20 below the speed limit. And based on that, like he would find these like heuristics on personality and how that would fit into the specific role. So yeah, Ben, I think you're hitting the nail on the head with that, which is we need sort of heuristics on how someone will do in the role. And personality can be attained, at least in theory, from these fancy Gen AI models. At a minimum, you can have eloquence, pace, cadence, that type of thing in speech. But do you think we could go so far as to say, are you a good personality match for the role?
I mean, provided that it has the ability. I mean, I'm not saying that this would be a trivial model to build or a trivial
Fair.
system of models to build, but I don't think it's too far off. If you had the money and the time to do it, you could build that system. And it would just be a suite of models that would be fine-tuned for particular classification tasks.
Could also kind of fall back to, there's a lot of models out there, that personality models, Myers-Briggs, things like that. So do you want to reinvent that wheel or not? I don't know.
True. That is a good call out. So, Keith, I have another question for you. This week was Databricks Data and AI Summit. We publish episodes about a month after, so at time of publishing or time of listening, it will be after it. But I was working the generative AI booth for way too long, and at least a couple hundred people came up and asked questions, and about like 10 of those questions were, how do I implement a resume screener for or using LLMs? Because everybody's executive is saying use AI, and people are saying, well, maybe I can augment the hiring process by using generative AI to at least extract information from resumes and maybe even make decisions on whether they should pass. Do you guys think about using Gen AI for that use case?
Yeah, I think it's a strong case, and I would probably argue it's being somewhat saturated already. At most recruitment management, talent acquisition systems out there are looking into doing that. Um, the challenge I would have with just doing that from where we are is that I think it's kind of the problem I said before. They're going to be looking at it from the data that's collected either in the resume, some of the screening process, and it's going to be subject around that silo of data. Um, I think I would look more into it if there was still a gap in its ability based off of just that silo to say, okay, well, it needs to really bring in historical data and other elements, then perhaps we would be more interested in it. But I think that's something that those talent acquisition systems are spending a lot of money to implement, and they could probably do a pretty good job with just that amount of data as it is. It's not something that we would really go after initially. Where we see utilizing, say, generative AI and LLM is twofold. Some that you see right now is where a user could say, okay, I want to find more information about X headcount or how headcount interacts with turnover in these departments. So some of those, our competitors and us will use LLM to help generate, say, a query or point them in the right direction within the application to pull that information, whether it's a dashboard, whether it's a report, whether it's just querying data and presenting that. And that's all well and fine. It's basically utilizing an application's metadata to help navigate the person to the right area. It's a great use case and time saver, click saver, if you will. But we're going to take that a little bit further, where we want to try to work with data, not just the metadata about what we're capturing, but also the data itself. So imagine summarizing an entire dashboard, summarizing and then having a conversation to go deeper. Okay, here's a dashboard, HR dashboard containing headcount, turnover, mobility. It's just some things for the last 4 quarters, broken down by organizational structure. So imagine throwing that at an LLM and then being able to have come back and summarize what the user's seeing. Because a lot of our dashboards, we're presenting to an executive, to an HR person. Sometimes, even though they know the metrics, they know that looking at the dashboards, oh, okay, that looks great, and they walk off and they do whatever they were doing before. But perhaps having a summary, or having LLM say, you know what, this is what you should be looking at. This is, we're detecting something happening over here. And I think those are good use cases that a generative AI model could use, not just from the metadata, but also from the data itself. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, it does to me quite a bit. I think that's the holy grail in analytics these days, is exactly what you described. You take a company that starts an initiative 10 years ago where everybody was like, let the data decide. We're a data-driven organization. What happens 5 years on from that? You now have all the ETL set up, all of the BI set up. You've acquired, enterprise licenses for Tableau or Power BI. You've hired 15 people in the analytics department to answer questions about the business. 5 years on from that, what do you see? Information overload. I've been at places where I've gone into Tableau to kind of see, like, I need insights on the business. I need to figure out an answer to my question here, because I'm curious, like, should we focus on building a model for this part of the business or this other one? You start looking through dashboard after dashboard after dashboard. Like, hang on, for our product lineup, we have 847 dashboards. I don't even know which one to use. They're all running every day. They're all up to date. They're all cutting the data in different ways. And then you end up having to ask a person, say, hey, I just need to see, like, are we going to be, like, should I build something that's going to optimize, revenue generation for product X or product Z? They're like, well, you need to go to these 7 different dashboards, and then there's a meta dashboard that kind of combines those. Like, can you just tell me which one? Like, just give me a link. So from an executive point of view, that's why they have assistants that are interfacing with the BI team. And sometimes where it's just, I don't want to look through all this stuff. Just tell me, like, give me a dashboard, build it for me that answers this one question. And it becomes daunting to run your business when I think it's impossible in today's modern age to run your business without analytics. That's just a bad idea. But in the information overload age, which I think we're in now, for business analytics, how do you find the needle in the haystack? And I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think there's going to be much more. I know that Databricks is working on it. The ability to do exactly what you're doing is models that have been fine-tuned on extracting relational data, structured table format data, and making through the use of agents that can say, I'm going to run a query on this raw data, and I'm going to figure out what comes out of it based on this algorithm that I have access to. And then I'm going to write a human readable format that says, here's the top 5 things that are problematic that I'm seeing in your data. And here's some suggestions of where to go next to dig in deeper. And tools like that, I think, for what we're talking about on the HR process, to say, are we hiring correctly? Or do we need to make a cultural change, rather than trying to say, you know, our kitchen's clean and it's just our diners that are messed up, or we need to find better diners. It's more like, do you need to change the menu? And maybe like these tools analyzing the data that a company's collecting are the ways to sort of expose that, to say, yeah, let's change our direction of the food we're making here, so people will come, like the right people will come in.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. The hiring process is a binary decision, maybe with a when and a how much, but distilling hundreds of pieces of information into that decision is really complex and challenging. So, yeah, any tools that can augment would definitely be helpful. And Keith, I'm curious, how do you guys approach information overload? Do you just throw everything at the person and say good luck, or do you try to steer?
It's a great issue, and I think we're entering into that information overload age, right? So I think, as I mentioned, some of the things with LLM is going to help, get summarize the data. So being able to take large quantities of dashboards and dashboard data to be able to first summarize, and then conversation through that to pinpoint, what a person should be looking at. So that's definitely, I think, the direction it's going to be going in. Currently right now, we also are highly consultative with our clients. So, we don't have a one size fit all. We work with our clients to understand their uniqueness and again, what their business problems are, and put those in front of the client in terms of what reporting, what metrics, what graphs, what dashboards are going to make the most amount of sense. So right now it's still probably a manual effort, but we see that changing very quickly.
Got it. And have you seen the consulting model scale? As
I've
in
heard
from
of
a
it. I
business
haven't.
perspective? No,
Yeah, I
like,
haven't.
sorry, when you do this consulting model within your business, is that
Okay.
scaling, or because if you have a software product that's automated, anyone can use it, right? So does
Right.
that sort of limit the organization's growth?
Um, I don't believe so, because it's, we've tried to take out we've tried to make things repeatable as much as possible and configurable. So we're not building from scratch each time. So we look at a lot of features to copy than just tweak. So we're trying to reduce that level of effort to get something unique for a client. But there is a level of resource needed, and of course that's going to impact scale. But we feel that it's important, and clients are willing to pay for that.
Yeah, I don't see there's an alternative though. Like from what you're saying, and in my own personal history with dealing with teams like that within an organization, you're 100% right. Like if they do have an IT person, it's to help resource set HR passwords or access to systems. You're never going to get, like, I've only seen it a handful of companies that I've either worked with or talked to. They're like, yeah, we have like dedicated software engineers for HR. And I'm like, what company is this? And you realize, like, oh, you're a FANG company. Like, of course you have like a team of 15 engineers that just do HR stuff. And no other software engineers talk to them. But that, like, those teams don't exist at 99% of companies out there. So yeah, if you're getting into this business, it's not like you can tell the head of HR, like, yeah, give me access to Greenhouse, just set up the API for me, and make sure that we have a token. They'll be like, what are you talking about? So yeah, you need consultants to go in there and be like, here's what we're going to do, and here's the data we need to get, and if you give us access, we'll get that working for you. So it
Yeah,
makes sense.
from an HR perspective too, there's a lot of, over the last several years, a lot of shifting from one siloed application to another. Oh, we use this learning management system, now we use this one. We went from uh, Lawson to Workday. We went from, so in order to capture that historical data, they may have it. It's probably in, very simple format, but a ton of it, and they'll need a way to bring that all together. And so there's still a lot of that old school ETL data cleansing that needs to go on.
Cool. So I have one final question for you, Keith. It seems like you've held a variety of leadership positions and you've had to do the manual human version of this hiring process. So do you have any tips on how to hire?
Well, like I said before, depending on the types of roles, I do like aptitude testing from a high level perspective. I think that certainly helps. Uh, and to kind of go off what Ben was saying before too, I think there is a level of experience in looking at resumes, and there's a lot you can weed out. I also try to weed out things that are buzzwords. I don't like to see a lot of buzzwords in a resume. Um, and that kind of is a red flag for me. Um, there's the main things I would say, and that, interviews are still important. One day I think we'll get to more help in the decision making process, but those are things that I'm looking for now. And I'm also a firm believer that we do make a higher decision. Um, to create the environment, the nurturing environment for them to succeed. So it's bi-directional. It's not just the candidate, but it's the environment and making an environment where someone can be successful.
Well put. And then Ben, I have one more question for you. Do you think from a code screening perspective, specifically in open source, we could remove the coding interview and just look at someone's historical contributions?
Historical contributions, that'll work if provided that there's a bunch of stars that align. So if you are somebody who has contributed to open source, yeah, we're looking at that. We're not looking at the code though, per se. I mean, we do. When we are evaluating candidates, we're looking at their commit history. So specifically, what was the first commit that they pushed? How many comments did it get or change requests? And that's not a detractor to be like, oh, they shipped something garbage or whatever for the first review. It's how do they interact with helpful comments and suggestions? Do they blindly accept, some, like, in an instance where the advice might have been bad, did they just go and do that? And it's like, okay, maybe they don't really know what's going on here. Or did they refuse to make the change or argue nonstop back and forth with a maintainer of a project? Those would be red flags. But if they've made the effort to, like, implement something of sufficient complexity and then work with the maintainers, and they're very personable and pleasant, and those are just like huge plus ones every time you see that. You're like, yeah, this person's great. Like, they seem like they would really fit in on our development team. But that is not like a requirement for any position at Databricks in engineering, because you can come from a company that has a zero open source policy. You're building code in private repos, but you are either not allowed to contribute to open source based on company policy, or you're too busy keeping the lights on and building features. We're not looking for somebody who lives, breathes, and eats software. And I think that's kind of dangerous. Like, those people do exist. They're very rare. They're like, hey, I worked my 9 to 7, and now on my weekend I'm contributing to open source. Like, cool, great. That's your passion. I'm not gonna knock it. But the rest of people, they're off hiking in the mountains. They're spending time with their family. That's super important. Like, don't spend your free time just doing work all the time. That's bad. And you're gonna burn out really quick if that's how you approach it. So we take all that into consideration. We don't have access to their contributions internally because, you know, proprietary code. So that's what the testing assessment is for. But I don't think testing assessment should be testing the ability of you being able to write, elite code. Um, I don't think that's very useful. It's more like give an actual real problem that's unique, see how they think through it. Doesn't matter if they get it completely correct. Uh, Let them mess up, let them self-correct, and talk to them about it. And the face-to-face interactive code test is always more effective in my experience, because you're able to really see how somebody thinks through a problem and then gauge what their reaction is to them messing something up. Like, do they freak out? Do they get super hostile or defensive? Probably not somebody you want to work with. But if they're humble and good at what they're doing and want to discuss and get excited about discussing this problem, and you're kind of like, yeah, this person's great. So I 100% believe in assessment tests. Just I don't like the fire and forget ones. And particularly in today's age with code generation, you can get GPT-4 to generate some code for you that will pass a lot of code interviews for the elite software companies. It's not that hard. So I don't think they're very effective anymore.
Heard. All right. Well, let me summarize really quick before we wrap. A lot of interesting things we discussed today. A few tips specifically in the HR space. For HR, model explainability is super important. People want to know why a model is generating the prediction that it is. Also, it's important to monitor the outcomes of the decisions that were based on your model's output. So typically this will take time. Sometimes it's a year, sometimes it's 2 years. If you can find early indicators of success, that's great. But it's important to understand that the model is a vehicle for decisions. Model accuracy is not what we're optimizing here. LLM-based resume screening is a very saturated market. So if you're doing a startup, maybe do something else. And then when hiring, consider using aptitude testing, and buzzwords are typically red flags. So, Keith, if people want to learn more about you or your organization, where should they go?
Yep, our website, zeroedin.com. And also feel free to connect with me in LinkedIn. Handles Keith A. Goode. I'd always love to carry on this conversation. I find it fascinating. And you guys have great questions, and Ben, I love your insight into what you're doing. It's been fantastic. I wish we had more time to keep going, but it's good. And I'd always love to carry on the conversation.
Yeah, no, likewise. We always get into like a nice little rhythm right around this time. So yeah, and HR is such a fascinating field. So, but unfortunately, we have lives and jobs. So with that, I will wrap. Until next time, it's been Michael Burke and my co-host,
Ben Wilson.
and have a good day, everyone.
We'll catch you next time.